Shakespeare had lots of soliloquies in his plays. And it's as if you're ignoring that there's an audience. You're speaking to yourself. You would step to the side of the stage and talk about whatever as if there wasn't an audience, even though the audience is right there. And it means solo, speak to yourself, okay? And it appealed to me because I do that a lot, but in a good way. I find that when I write some poetry, I really can't be confident that I have the rhyme correct and the meter correct, and those are two things that are important to me, unless I say it out loud. And even though I'm all by myself, I have to say it out loud before I'm satisfied. And a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago now, I was starting colts, and I was getting to the stage in my life where I didn't bounce back up off the ground just quite as fast as I used to. And I'd start thinking about that big chair I would sit in when I had broken ribs for 3 months, and I wouldn't be concentrating on the colt as much as I should be. And of course the colt will know that because they can feel a fly land on their rear end. And so I thought, I got to start doing something, and I came up with, I will say poetry while I'm starting a colt. And I sit up there and I start reciting poems, and it calms the colt, I think, and it certainly calms me because I'm thinking about what the next line is and so forth. I'm not sure that any of my horses ever learned poetry, but I thought this word soliloquy fits for me. So if you wind up getting one of these CDs, you will be in the CD called Saddle Tramp Soliloquy. So, the next thing I want to talk to you about is cowboy poetry itself, because that is something that people shake their head at if they don't know. How in the world would a cowboy and poet get into the same sentence? It just doesn't seem to make sense, but it makes perfect sense if you know a little bit about working with livestock, because that's really what it's all about. It's been going on for hundreds of years, but it really became in prominence in America after the Civil War. And after the Civil War, that's when huge herds of cattle were assembled in Texas and moved all the way up north through Kansas and all the way up to Canada, all the way to here. And if you ever saw Lonesome Dove, that's what I'm talking about. And those wranglers, those drovers of cattle, learned early on that since there's no fences and no horse trailers and nothing, you just got several thousand head of cattle moving north, that when you came to the end of the day, it was the practice that you would just start circling the herd, and you'd get them circling until they started to bed down, and pretty soon they're down and chewing their cub, and they're down for the night until morning. That's the way it's supposed to work. And they dispatch maybe 3 or 4 night riders depending on the herd, and their night riders, their job was to just circle the herd and keep an eye out for predators, but mostly to keep the cattle quiet. Well, if they did that in silence, especially in a night that was cloudy or the moon wasn't shining, they ran a risk of creating a stampede, because in the dark, if they were quiet, they could spook a half a dozen cows that didn't know they were coming, and then that could spook 40 or 50 cows, and then 300 cows, and pretty soon 3,000 cows are on the run, all because you were being quiet when you were a night rider. So they learned that they would quietly talk or whistle or hum a song or whatever, but they were always making a little bit of noise. It wasn't hooting and hollering, it was just quiet noise. Some of those cowboys had stories to tell their horses, and some of those stories were pretty good. And they'd want to remember it for the campfire. Well, a good way to remember a story is to put it into rhyme. And that's really the origin of cowboy poetry. So I want you to step aboard now and ride the long trail of stories that come to mind as I make my way through the Canadian Rockies as a guide or a packer or a mountie or a saddle tramp. Take a deep seat, enjoy, regardless if you have or you haven't stabbed your boot in the stirrup, turned your horse up a rocky trail that leads to a high mountain meadow where there ain't no telephones or mail. 'cause I reckon it's my good fortune it's easy for me to find a memory of such a journey. It's one of many that come to mind. It was early one autumn morning when Sharp and I broke camp. We flopped our gear in the darkness with a clear sky moon as our lamp, and there wasn't